Yeah. So, so just a bit of introduction about this event. So we wanted as a community to discuss a bit of to be at the intersection of different topics. So the community is about design, innovation, and also critical thinking. And we thought it would be a really great idea to find people from the applied ethics world. This is a big world, and ask them to join us here today and a bit introduce us to how they do and they see ethics in the organizations, in the maybe also in the more broader space, and so we just dropped a message on the social networks, and Alison and Charles kindly replied, and here we are. So, Corinna, I just let you introduce them briefly, and we can jump to the first talk that Alison will lead.
Yeah, so just a little quick introduction about tonight's subjects for people who might not remember exactly why they are here. So there is a lot of discussion about that subject of ethics in tech, design, innovation, and many of them revolve around the societal consequences of companies' decisions. So one of the logical steps is to look for public institutions to intervene and regulate. But institutions are slow and mainly work through systematic audits and expensive fines to incentivize change and behaviors. So another perspective would be to address the subject by involving organizations directly, but ethics in organizations is also usually approached and restricted to a question of compliance, mainly to avoid company exposure and reputational risks. So what should we do? Well, in order to grasp this question differently, we've invited Alison Taylor and Charles Paré, who will share perspectives on both strategic and practical approaches to ethics and sustainability in organizations. So who are our guests, which we are very happy to have here with us. Thanks to both of you for being here. So Alison is Executive Director of Ethical Systems, Senior Advisor at Business for Social Responsibility, and Adjunct Professor at NYU Stern School of Business. She has extensive experience consulting for multinational companies on risk, anti-corruption, sustainability, human rights, culture and behavior, stakeholder engagement, ESG, and ethics and compliance. And she is also a 2019 and 2021 member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Transparency and Anti-Corruption. And previously, she had leadership roles at BSR and Control Risks, and also worked at PwC, Transparency International, and EHS Global Insights. And for Charles Paré, he is a Senior Compliance, Ethics and Risk Executive at Unisys, an information technology company specialized in security related to software and services. Prior to that, he served for 5 years as Head of Ethics and Compliance EU West at Philip Morris International, supporting his colleagues in various markets, factories, and shared service centers with the transformation of the company and the launch of new modified risk products. Before that, he held various positions in ethics and compliance with global responsibility for risk management and the deployment of new technical solutions. So thank you again for being here. And now about the questions. You have a chat on your right, and what we propose you to do is to wait for our speakers to have finished their talk. And so only at the end of their speech, we will take a couple of questions that you would have shared during the speech. And also what we can do is afterwards, after their speech, we can all join the networking tables. And Alison and Charles will also stay with us, and we can all discuss a little more about questions that you might have. So here we go. Alison.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Karina, for that fantastic introduction. I'm now going to attempt to share my screen. There we go. Karina, can you see? It's still happening. Can you see the slide?
Not so far. Oh,
now I see. Yeah, you have it?
Yes, perfect.
Have it? Fantastic. So as you can see, the title of this presentation is The Future of Business Ethics. And what I'm going to try to do is just set the context for how we think about business ethics and why that is now changing so fast. So this might be familiar to some people on the line, or others might have a different understanding of what we mean. So will be interesting to hear how much of this is familiar. So let's kind of start off just by framing the challenge. We know that shaping an ethical, effective and cooperative culture is among the most important responsibilities of corporate leadership. If we have an ethical, effective culture, that is a significant source of external competitive advantage. It is a precondition for having a successful strategy. It helps with trust, engagement, innovation, enjoyment. It reduces cheating, law breaking, backstabbing, bullying, harassment, and racism. And it creates a sense of common purpose and motivation that then drives value for all stakeholders. So there are a lot of reasons to want to have an ethical business culture, but this seems to be an extremely difficult challenge. And if you go back centuries and centuries, even before the millennium, and you read Confucius or Cicero, you will see questions of sales ethics, of bluffing, of truth and disclosure, of how ethical it is to pursue the profit motive. These are really, really old debates. So one question we might ask is why we have made so little progress and why now might be different. And I'm arguing that now is different and has very profound challenges and very profound implications for the tech sector. So let's think, first of all, about questions of business ethics and what they are. If we think about them from an academic perspective, if we're taking professional responsibility classes in business schools or law schools, we will understand that business ethics is treated from one of two perspectives. The first is philosophical. So that is a conversation about how things should be. What principles business should observe? Should they try to be utilitarians and foster the greatest good? Should they try to meet particular principles? Should they drive their own self-interest? So the conversation about philosophy is a question of how business should behave. There is then another entire discipline called, called moral psychology or social psychology or organizational psychology. And that is more descriptive. And that attempts to describe human nature, how human beings really behave, how influenced we are by the cultures and the other people around us, and to talk about, therefore, from what we understand about human psychology and human behavior, how could we design organizations to be more ethical? So if you study business ethics in an academic or university environment, you will usually take as your starting point either psychology or philosophy. However, then, if you turn to ethics in business, you will see a very, very different picture. In businesses, people do not sit around in meetings saying, should we take the utilitarian or the deontological perspective to this decision? And in fact, also businesses, while they are very, very proficient at using psychological tools and behavioral science to try and make their customers buy more and things like that, they have paid very limited attention to date to psychology and helping design more ethical business. What we rather see in terms of the dominant approach to business ethics is that there are at least 3 separate functions or departments in a business, and they have what is called an ethical function. But I would argue that the function of these departments has got far less to do with business ethics as we would understand it, and far more to do with, as Karina described in her introduction, deflecting regulatory or reputational risk. So we have compliance, which is very often called ethics and compliance these days. And the role of the compliance function is to establish policies and processes to deflect regulatory risk and ensure that the company does not break the law. So the corporation aims to demonstrate, in general, we've got these principles, we've got these policies, we've got these processes, we've got these rules. And so if there is a problem here, that must be caused by a bad person breaking those rules. And if we remove the bad person, the organization won't have a problem. So compliance is about rules, and it is about proving to regulators that you followed those rules. Compliance, at least as it's commonly understood, does not have that much to say about things like incentive structures. It has a little bit to say about leadership, but not so much about the other things that might be going on in the organization. And so very often what happens is, for example, if you're in a sales function, you will have a compliance team saying, break the laws, sign these policies and processes. If you break the rules, you'll get fired. And then maybe you have your boss saying, develop this product, sell this thing. And if you don't meet your targets, you'll get fired. So very often what ends up is that employees are forced to choose between ethical direction and meeting their goals. And this is what causes a lot of problems. Also, if compliance processes are overly draconian, human psychology suggests that we all start to focus on how we can get around the stupid rules rather than thinking about the ethical implications of our decisions. So it can be a little disempowering. Then we have a department called Human Resources. That is about the deployment of human capital. Human Resources deals with allegations of harassment, discrimination, and then increasingly today deals with programs around diversity, equity, and inclusion. But in fact, the goal of the Human Resources team is less about helping human beings in the organization reach their full potential, but also, similar to the compliance department, the aim is to protect the corporation from litigation and reputational damage about being discriminatory or leaders participating in harassment and that kind of thing. So again, it is this kind of metaphor of a fort. You can see this picture of a fort on this slide. The idea is about deflecting risk and deflecting scrutiny. It is not so much really about ethics. And then finally, we have a department that might be called CSR or sustainability or corporate citizenship or ESG. That is much less about meeting the law. That is more about voluntary social and environmental commitments and risks and opportunities. What will the company do about climate change? What will the company do about human rights? What will the company do about labor rights or how employees are treated in the supply chain? What will the company do about waste? So beyond legal risk is where the sustainability or CSR department comes in. But very, very often that department spends its whole year producing glossy reports about all the wonderful things the company does. And I've heard it called the paramilitary wing of the marketing department. So again, this is more about reputation than core ethics commitments. And so companies have built these kind of fortresses of policies and processes that protect the corporation above all. This has been very, very effective. Corporations tend to have very aggressive non-competes, non-disclosure agreements, PR teams that manage the narrative about what is said about them. And that is really the goal of ethics functions more than ethics per se. But for many, many reasons, this traditional approach that has served companies very well for many, many decades is no longer tenable. And there are 5 reasons I would argue for this. The first is that there is rising political polarization, there is rising populism, democracy is in crisis. Businesses historically have said, we don't get involved in politics, we're neutral, we don't get involved in taking positions on things like immigration and climate change and human rights. That's all up to the government, and we just stay neutral and we keep out of it. We don't want to alienate any of our customers. But since, especially around 2015 and 2016, and particularly, but not exclusively in the United States, we started to see that all break down, and we've started to see companies, and particularly tech companies, start to take far more explicit positions on political issues, on things like immigration, on things like gun control, on things like tech and human rights. So this idea that business can be politically neutral and keep out of these debates has really, really broken down over the last 5 years. So whatever tech companies decide they're going to do about the impact of their products, that will draw a lot of scrutiny and that will draw a lot of attention. We've also obviously seen the rise of social media. That's been going on for 20 or 25 years by now. It's easy, though, to miss the degree to which internet and social media adoption is still accelerating, particularly in the developing countries. And really the rise of social media has led to this emergence of a new whistleblowing model where employees are far less likely to kind of call the hotline and complain that there is an ethical issue going on in the company. They're far more likely to leak their concerns either to the media or onto social media and let the public judge what is going on. We can see this very, very clearly in the ongoing turmoil at Google at the moment about how it has treated its AI researchers. And so this has been less an issue of those AI researchers calling the internal hotline and more about them people going onto the media and saying, look at how unethical Google is. So Google and other companies in general, this is in general an issue, can no longer control their reputations, can no longer control the narrative and what is said about them. And to a very great degree, that reflects increased employee power. So employees, it's kind of like, even if you're a really, really powerful army, you can be undermined by really skilled guerrilla warfare in cities. And it's a little bit like that. Employees have disproportionate power because they have access to information that they can use to cause reputational damage. So this is really changing how companies need to think about managing their reputations, and it's making those functions that are all about reputational management have to rethink what they're doing, and those traditional approaches are no longer fit for purpose. There's then a great new focus on questions of racism, sexism, abuse of power in the workplace. That's been exemplified in the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements, both of which enormously affect the tech sector, which is not a very diverse sector in general. In general, what you see here is that young employees have very different beliefs about diversity and inclusion from older employees. And so you start to see these conflicts around sexism and racism and values becoming to a very great degree hierarchical conflicts. So increasingly you see younger employees challenging their older, usually white male leadership on questions of values and that kind of thing. You then see the arrival of Gen Z adding on to young millennials. Gen Z began to graduate in 2018. They're far more anxious. They're far more stressed out. They're far more economically anxious. And then much, much more focused on diversity and inclusion and much, much more interested in working for organizations that reflect their personal values. And then finally, you've seen this very profound rhetorical shift where companies used to say, we just focus on shareholder value, it's just our business model, we don't get involved in social and environmental issues, to this idea of stakeholder capitalism. So in the last few years, most large companies have said, we no longer plan our strategy just from the perspective of shareholder value. We really choose to build value for all stakeholders, and we try to have a social purpose beyond making money. And once leaders start to say we have values beyond the profit motive, they really open up this huge space for debate inside organizations about what those values should be. And that is to a very great degree causing a lot of conflict and a lot of very interesting emerging discussions in the tech sector right now about questions of values and responsibility, diversity, and how to lead and that kind of thing. So as a result of these 5 forces, this idea that you have kind of control functions to deflect regulatory and reputational risk is no longer really tenable. And those kind of oversight functions are finding themselves very, very challenged to respond to these new dynamics, which don't really fit neatly in either sustainability or HR or compliance. They, by necessity, involve not only those functions working together to genuinely build a more ethical culture, but they require core employees to consider the ethical implications of those decisions and not just outsource those decisions to an ethics function. So we're in this situation today where leaders must be responsive to new and valid concerns about gender, race, language, and identity. They must build cultures where employees can speak up and raise concerns and use their own ethical muscles and know what ethical frameworks to use, but also ensuring that those cultures don't morph into call-out cultures where there's endless conflict and endless judgment. Leaders must clearly define the moral community and develop a moral narrative that's less about control and legal risk and is focused much more on humility and cooperation. They must empower employees to consider ethical issues in their core roles, in product development, in sales, not just in compliance and in HR, and invite a more collaborative debate about organizational values. They must encourage employees to not bring their whole selves to work, but to understand that we all need to urgently learn to work with other people that might have very, very different personal values from us. And then finally, very important for company leaders to understand the mindset of younger generations and lead in ways that presume the ability to grow from challenges and setbacks rather than from fragility. So I think kind of in conclusion, what we need to have is a conversation about what ethics means to everybody in the organization, and not just how can we outsource these decisions to a function that will be there to kind of apologize or deflect legal scrutiny, but really has nothing to do with business ethics. So I will stop there and I'll hand over to Charles to pick up the discussion.
Well, thanks a lot, Alison. I mean, that's a perfect transition, because just would like to thank Corina and Kevin for having me and having invited me. I'm really happy that this conversation can really occur and can happen. And looking at the participants here, I'm sure we're going to have an exciting follow-up. And thanks a lot, Alison, for setting the scene. Maybe to make it very simple, there are 2 things that really kept me awake the past 20 years through my career. The first one is, why do really good people mess up? I mean, why do our colleagues, people that we know, either break the law or behave really in a questionable way? And what can we do to prevent it? And the second one, how can we change that horrible belief that compliant behavior, so following by the letter, by the book, all the rules, doesn't equal to ethical behavior? Now, looking at these 2 paradigms, as Alison said, ethics is really at the end a personal thing. And if we try to define that problem, you all go in the morning to your own company, to a company that's employing you, you join a project team, you work towards objectives, and you all sustain that belief that we will deliver great results and shareholder value and work for a company that's a great corporate citizen that also ends up paying dividends on our salaries. And then you look up at the wall, you download the code of conduct of your company, you see honesty, respect, fairness, integrity, we save the world and we are good corporate citizens. but then you look at your mailbox, you look at your project objectives, and sometimes there is kind of a mismatch. So how do you actually really make it work? That's the real problem definition. Now, I will try to give you very practical answers. Are they universal? No. Are they complicated? Neither. I would like you to imagine a triangle. On that triangle, you have in one corner the values of your company, what your company is promoting to stand for, and I love Alison's sentence of the paramilitary part of marketing. That's very true. I mean, what is the company really saying? What are those values? That's on one corner. On the top, you have your own values. What does ethic mean to you? And if you haven't done it until now, I really invite you tomorrow, sit down with your team and ask your team members this question. Look, when I say ethics to you, how does it resonate? Translate it in common language to me. So on the top of the triangle, you have your own values, the ones that you convey to your children, the ones that would really make you tick. And then you have the last piece of the triangle. That's where you try to get those two in sync, and where you are trying to correlate what you think is right with what the company wants to think is right, and what you're actually asked to deliver and to do day in, day out. And I will take two extreme examples. There is a misperception that the purpose of a corporation is by default going to make your actions within that corporation ethically defendable. And it's going to make you feel good. Now, let's take the example. You're working for a non-governmental organization which is collecting funds to build fantastic projects in developing countries, in Africa, for example, so that we can provide clean water in villages. This is a fantastic purpose. I mean, everybody would love to work for this company, but if the way to collect those funds is by cheating and by diverting 50% of the funds for marketing and the salaries of the managers in that non-governmental organization, then there is a big question mark. Is that really ethical? And I'm taking now the absolute other extreme. On purpose, you take a defense company which is producing weapons. There is no way anyone can tell me that this is an ethical purpose. But there are still people working in that company, and they found very likely a way to feel okay with what they are doing. Very likely because the way they are executing their day-to-day task, which of course is not going to be marketing, but very likely invoicing, talking to customers, making sure quality is there, and so on. And they do it in the most honest possible way in accordance with their values. And I wanted to make these two examples just really to highlight that the purpose of a corporation is not going to necessarily make you feel good about the way you do your job. At the same way, just because a corporation has a fantastic code of conduct, it doesn't mean that on your day-to-day job, you will be in sync with your own ethical values. So how do you solve that problem? We will approach it from two parts. First, as an individual, and then as a team. As an individual, you make a conscious decision every morning when you stop pressing the snooze button, and if you work from home, then you make a decision to somehow arrive in front of your laptop and connect to your first horrible Zoom call with a coffee, but you made that decision to engage with the company and get your work done for three reasons. The first reason, you have bills to pay at home. The second one, society is kind of expecting you to deliver that job. And the third one, you don't feel too bad in the evening where your kids are asking you, what did you do the whole day? So for these three reasons, you keep on going to work. And somewhere hidden is also the fact that you can look in the mirror every morning and say, well, I kind of find my way of what I'm doing. Imagine you work for a bank and you need to design a software which is going to maximize the profiling of the consumers who can get a loan. through a little bit of artificial intelligence, and it's going to make sure it's excluding people who don't score perfectly on the criteria. So by default, divorced mothers who are raising their children alone at home and don't have a stable income will not get a loan from your bank. You're delivering shareholder value, but you may question, is what I'm doing actually ethically defendable? And every day you find your way in that. Or let's imagine you're building a fantastic marketing campaign. A marketing campaign for a new sweet product, or for a new fast food product. You will find a way to do that in sync with your own values. And the way you find it is because you have a conversation with yourself. You have a reasonable exchange and you reach a compromise saying, there are certain values, honesty, I'm not going to lie and cheat. Moral values, what do I think society should look like? And my own values, where do I see myself playing a role? To what extent do I feel concerned with what's going on in the world? And when discussing that compromise with yourself, you find a way to adapt to what the company is asking you to do. And I really would like you to focus on that compromise, because this is exactly the compromise which is also enabling people to do really horrible things and feel absolutely okay about it. And it's called, I mean, you can look, Dan Ariely wrote quite a lot about it, rationalization. Our fantastic ability as human beings to rationalize what we are doing. And if you want a lot of examples, open up history books or just look at what happened at the Capitol a couple of weeks ago. Those people were utterly convinced that they were doing something really cool. And they felt good about it. And they needed maybe a wake-up call saying, that's actually maybe not exactly right. But we always find a way to rationalize our behavior because of our ability to have this discussion between our own values and how we make them match reality. Today, you cannot match that. Three things can happen. The first one, your body will start to signal it to you. Either you get diabetes or you get burnout, but bottom line, you will not be able, your body will not carry you to work. The second, you stop the mechanics, you quit, and you find another job which feels better for you. And the third one, you give up on your values. There are not really many other options. So to avoid them, you will keep on building that compromise. And here, honestly, you don't need a code of conduct. Every single employee in a corporation is doing that without compliance department, without human resources. What really makes a difference here is what the leader, the boss, the manager, or whomever is the highest paid person in the room that people trust is telling you to do and how they are selling it to you. And then you make the decision, am I going to believe this? Am I going to adhere to this? And am I going to fit in there? If we take that compromise and now we bring it to a team structure, this is where it starts to get really, really interesting, because imagine a team of 5 people, and I understand that a lot of you are working in agile structures, developing technology and all of that. So you take your product owner, your scrum masters, and you take a group of developers. And to make it really real world, all the 5 or 6 of you are in different physical locations. So you are communicating via Zoom and cameras and Slack and whatever you want. So you even remove that ability of having these informal interactions around the coffee machine that we used to have. Now, all the 6 people woke up in the morning and made exactly the same compromise and exactly the same rationalization mechanic to feel okay with what they're going to do there. Guess what? The problem is that it's not the same reasoning for the 6 people, because we are individual human beings and we find our own ways. We have our own boundaries, our own moral compass. And the 6 people who start to work on a project, sometimes the miracle happens and everybody has the same boundary. And sometimes that miracle doesn't happen and you have diverging boundaries. And this is exactly when you will see the first thing, the project is not advancing. You know, when you keep on postponing and you have the backlog which is piling up in your waterfall chart, that's exactly that. You simply have people who are absolutely not aligned, not only on the deliverables, but on their own moral compass on what they are expected to do. The second thing that can happen, you have people who simply disengage from the project. You know, the developer who pretends to be delivering, but actually is absolutely not delivering, but you just don't see it. And you have that when you outsource certain parts of your sprint. And the third one is that the leader tries to set it back and have the discussion. And this is what big corporations are trying to artificially create, because they don't really have another choice. So they do a big campaign, they do a big code of conduct, they communicate a lot on the values of the company. And there is kind of this permanent, sorry for the word brainwashing, but this permanent communication on what is right, what is wrong, what are the values of the company. And this is fantastic because it is saving a lot of time, and it is helping a group of 6 individuals who arrived with maybe a diverging moral compass to say, oh, there's an easy story that I can buy. I feel actually okay with it. I go into the project with that story because it works for me. This is why the big compliance communications and ethics and compliance communications that you have in big corporations are so necessary, because they fix this unequal compromises. But what do you do when you don't have it? Or what do you do when it's not efficient? Well, then you need to create it yourself. And you cannot wait for the scrum master, the product owner, or the highest paid person in the room to initiate a conversation. You, as a member of a team, of a project team, each of you has this responsibility to sit down, and you can do that before the sprint start discussions, or at the beginning of a project meeting, or every week when you have status meetings, and simply just have an open discussion. And maybe what I will tell you is going to shock you or surprise you. The best way to do it is to ask an open question to the round and create an expectation that everybody is going to answer. And that open question is very human and very complicated. It's simply, how are you feeling about what we're going to do? It is not what do you think about what are we going to do. It's not do you think what we're going to do is morally okay. Just ask people, how are you feeling about what we're going to do? Because being in sync with ethical values is an emotional and not a rational question. You know that horrible gut feeling that you have inside when you did something which wasn't exactly okay, you feel it very well the next day. Now, that's exactly the same. And encouraging those discussions makes a huge difference. Now, some of you may not be working in a team or in a project. You're interacting with consumers, with customers. You're trying to sell them stuff. You're engaging with them. You may be a lawyer who has clients. The same applies. Try that magical thing. You start to work with a client on a project and you ask them, look, I just want to know, how are you feeling about this? And from a moral, ethical, societal perspective, where do you see the boundaries? And you create a conversation. Now, the goal is not to convince the other one that your values are better than his values. That's not the way it's going to work. The goal is simply to listen to the other one and respect that the other person in the team has his, her own values. And by having those values openly on the table, you created an open exchange where everybody can find a little bit like an open buffet. Oh, that's matching, that one I can deal with, that's a boundary I'm not going to cross. But you have it open on the table. I've tested it personally. It works in most of the instances, but what I always say is this may take time, this may be expensive, but I encourage you to try it, because if you try to do it without, it's going to be much more expensive and it's not going to necessarily help. So in conclusion, getting ethics right in a corporation is not a question of budget. It's not a question of code of conduct. It's not a question of big departments trying to save the world on behalf of the others. It's a question of individual responsibility and how much you are connected to actually finding the right compromise between your values and what your employer is asking you to do. And now happy to move to questions.
Thank you very much, Charles and Alison. It was really, really interesting. We have some questions in the question panel. So if you don't see my message in the chat yet, you have a questions button on the right hand side of your screen. You can leave a question here. We already have 2 questions. So one is directed to Charles. The question is from Cyril Galland. Is asking, how do you feel about what we are about to do, enough to create a wake-up call that can beat the rationalization of an individual?
It's a very good question. So just asking the question is not going to create a wake-up call. Creating the honest feeling in the person who is getting the question that you actually really want an answer and you're really interested in the answer is going to create a wake-up call, yes. That's the whole difference between your boss asking you in the morning, how are you doing? And you very well knowing that he doesn't mean it. And actually someone really asking you, hey, how is it going? That's the whole difference. The wake-up call comes really from, do you honestly want to have an answer and are you interested in exchanging about it?
Thank you. Another question, which seems really open, so both of you can answer it. So from John Collette, should we have chief philosophy or ethical officers in companies or boards, or should we make ethical training mandatory for new joiners or employees so that they can make their own decisions, or a combination of these approaches, or neither?
I'm interested to know what Charles thinks about this as well, but I'll try this first. Okay. I would say yes to both. There is, as a result of the kind of balkanized approach and the incoherence that I described at the beginning, now a lot of companies are starting to hire a sort of lead integrity or ethics role that has a broader remit than just legal and compliance. So Novartis is a good example. There is one leader there that has human rights and sustainability and risk and compliance all reporting into the same person. Salesforce is another really good example. They've hired, I think she has a PhD in philosophy. They've hired a woman called Paula Goldman that considers the totality of Salesforce's ethical commitments, meaning that, for example, if you're going to make a commitment to reducing your environmental emissions, okay, you can do that. You also need to look at whether you're going to take business from oil and gas companies. You also need to look at your lobbying. You need to look at the totality of what you are saying about environmental responsibility. And she has been really hired to do that. And something that they do at Salesforce is an exercise called consequence scanning, where when they develop a new product, they consider all the long-term uses that product could be put to. They use scenario planning. They think about the kind of long-term implications to really kind of try and build those muscles that Charles described of just helping us kind of tap into these things. Then training, yes, I mean, there's a lot of training already, right, about what you should and shouldn't do. There is now training available that helps people kind of empower themselves to make these better decisions. I know, for example, the Omidyar network has put together interactive training for tech product developers to help them consider the ethical implications of what they're doing. So I would say both, and I would finish by saying a lot of boards have very, very, very limited expertise on these issues. NYU just did a big research study about board capacity, even on things like corruption, much less kind of more widespread ESG issues. There's a tendency to hire ex-CEOs and CFOs. And so a lot of boards don't know what they're talking about when it comes to these issues. And that's a massive problem. So I don't think maybe these are the full answers, but a combination of both those things I think would definitely be helpful depending on what exactly the training looks like.
Thank you. Charles, you have
I'm fully aligned with Alison. I would add one thing is, yes, we need chief ethics officers and so on, but for me, the key person to really make a difference is the guy who is deciding on your career. Your direct boss, the person who is signing your objectives, who is telling you pretty much what to do. That person is your own chief compliance officer. And what I always encourage to do is when you have new joiners, okay, they get the big package and they need to sign that they read and digested and believe in the code of conduct and whatever. But what really makes a difference is making it mandatory that these new joiners within their first week or two have a face-to-face, human-to-human conversation with their boss about ethics and compliance, where really down-to-earth questions come to the table, where the boss is going to tell them, look, this is really important for me. Okay, I didn't read it since 2 years, but trust me, this is important. We not fuzz around this. There is no shortcut, but you can come to me if you mess up. And creating that honest exchange is doing a hell lot. The problem is that most corporations are still doing a press the button, tick the box exercise by having new joiners sign a code of conduct and believing with that they are trained and onboarded. That's not making a difference. What's really making a difference is the guy who decides on your career should tell you that compliance and ethics matter.
Thank you, Charles. Corinna, do you want to pick one last question, and then we move to the networking session, and then everyone can ask any questions to our speakers.
Okay. So why is HR in practice a mechanism to disconnect from ethics, given the recruiting, promoting bonus tracks reflecting the most skillful scammers are immune to scrutiny and climb the ladder? I'm not sure if did you
get the question?
Maybe not.
Well, I'm happy to bounce back. HR, human resources, is a fantastic department. And I've seen fantastic HR departments and I've seen horrible HR departments. The problem is I've seen fantastic compliance departments and horrible compliance departments too. So if you have a horrible compliance and a horrible HR department, indeed, you're in trouble. If you have one that works better than the other, then go to the one you trust.
I mean, that's a really nice, succinct answer. I mean, the question, why is HR like this? The job of HR is to protect the corporate principal, the fictional corporate person, from risk. So it's not that the HR person you're speaking to necessarily has anything against you or wants to harm you. But if there is a problem, the goal of that HR person will be to protect the reputation and legal position of the company and allow it to drive the best value. So I think people often feel very frustrated because HR gives the impression that they are there to help you and act in their interests, and that their role is in fact to act in the company's interests. And so where there is a disconnect between those two things, HR may not necessarily help you because it's not in fact their job. So I see there was another question about calling HR a chief happiness officer. Yeah. I'm suspicious of that kind of branding. Very often there are ethical challenges. This comes from a guy called Edgar Schein. There are ethical challenges because there is a difference between what the company says it believes and what it signals it believes. This is exactly what Charles has been talking about as well. So if there's a narrative that says HR is there to enhance your happiness, but everything about the way HR behaves sends a different message, all that's going to do is undermine trust and undermine ethics. So I think one of the things is hypocrisy and just being clear about what exactly these support functions can and can't do for you. And I couldn't agree with Charles more that the issue is your boss and the person evaluating you and what they value and reward. No, these oversight functions are more about deflecting problems.
Yeah, and it begs the question: who defines what happiness is for the employees, right? Yeah, because it's not clear how it is defined, and it's not necessarily asked directly to the people that are concerned with the.
And maybe to be honest, I mean, if we look back in time, until I think 10 years ago, going to work was considered an activity which can be painful, which can be horrible, which is not the center of my life. Since 10 years, there is this tendency to try to invent a world where, the only thing which can give us purpose in the morning is to go to work and make sure that pension funds get their dividends. No, I mean, we just need to get back to real. If you're doing a fantastic job and you really love it, that doesn't hinder you to be happy, but there is no obligation to be happy at work. I'm very happy when I'm not at work. And I recommend everyone to think about it for a second.
Well, thank you very much. So I invite everyone to join the table when I end this session, so you can ask questions to our speakers or discuss all together. Thank you very much, and
thank you.
Thank you.